Jini Hernandez, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel from Washington, D.C. And recently, the president has brought up some discussion of tariffs and NAFTA, and we wanted to get some more information. A lot of people may not know that Canada is actually Illinois' #1 trading partner, that we do more trade with Canada than with any other state in the union. And so we sent Jini out to our viewers, I would say, to talk to our Canadian neighbors and to get some more information. And Jini, let's just start. Do you have any way of putting into context just how much the trade is between Canada and the United States?
Well, yes, Terry, actually, I spoke with Gitane DeSilva, who is Alberta's senior representative here in the U.S., and we got together at the Canadian Embassy and spoke a little bit about the real job numbers here in the U.S. that are provided because of our trade with Canada. We spoke a little bit about the amount of money that goes between Canada and the U.S., and overall in 2016 it was about $15 billion that was seen over trade with Illinois and Canada specifically. Not only is Illinois' #1 trading partner, but Alberta province is actually the #2 trading partner, so they're incredibly important for us and for our economy. And so she gave me some real numbers and just job figures that you can hear in the interview.
So some immediate things, I mean, there's about 64,000 jobs in Illinois that depend directly on trade with Alberta, almost 350,000 jobs in Illinois that depend directly on trade with Canada. So if trade between our jurisdictions becomes more difficult, there will be people that are hurt by that. There's a lot of two-way investment between Alberta and Illinois, and between Illinois and Canada. So that's another thing where companies are looking for investment to grow. There's a number of Alberta companies that directly employ people in Illinois. So I talked about the amount of oil that we supply into Illinois and the number of people in the state that are either directly employed by oil and natural gas companies or that benefit from the direct access to that resource. So Oxable is an example of a company where they bring in their natural gas from Canada and then they upgrade it there on site. That then goes right next door to a plastics company. So if you look at the direct employment benefits of those two entities, I mean, there's any number of examples there. So we really like to remind people that there's very real jobs on the line here. In addition to that, we've both benefited from the ease at which our people move back and forth across the border. So there's more than 400,000 people that cross the Canada-US border every day for business, for pleasure. Everyone likes to come and honeymoon in Banff National Park. So it's important too. We've got a lot of family ties and we wouldn't want to disrupt that either. And just the movement of goods as well. I think that you have to consider where your markets are. So we have a number of companies in Illinois where Canada is the #1 market for Illinois. Alberta is the #2 market for Illinois in the entire world. So if you make it more difficult for goods to move across the border, that'll have a direct impact.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive to hear that. And you know, also the president, not just talking about putting a tariff, and he had specifically talked about putting a tariff on steel and aluminum. But he had also talked about rewriting some of NAFTA. He thought the NAFTA deal, which is now approximately 25 years old, was not to the benefit of the United States. Did you happen to talk with Gitane DeSilva about their thoughts on whether we should take a new look at NAFTA?
Absolutely. And so when I spoke with her, she wanted to emphasize that Canada is not necessarily opposed to modernizing NAFTA. There's a lot of jobs that are listed that are not listed in NAFTA that she would like to add. They want provisions added. So there's nothing about the NAFTA negotiations that Canada is opposed to overall. Specific proposals that they do not, that they're just not in agreement with. And when I spoke with her, you could hear the examples that she was giving.
So Canada broadly has advanced a few proposals within NAFTA which are aimed at addressing some of the concerns. So we've added a progressive trade agenda. So we're trying to introduce a chapter on gender equality. We're trying to introduce a chapter on Indigenous rights. And we're trying to improve and modernize the chapters on labor protections and environmental protections. So Alberta supports all of that. We think that those are important, and if we're going to renegotiate NAFTA, that we should modernize it and bring it up to the current standard of trade agreements and provide this more progressive element. We're also interested in the labor mobility provisions under NAFTA. when NAFTA was signed almost 25 years ago, a lot of professions we have today were not even invented yet. So if you have a company, for example, which has operations in both Illinois and Alberta, and you may want to move your people back and forth to work on a particular project, if their profession is not listed on that list that's contained in the existing NAFTA, it becomes very challenging to do that. So that's somewhere we would like to see modernized and updated, because the economy has changed over time and we think there could be real benefit that. And there's some regulatory issues as well. There's still some areas where Canada and the United States, or Alberta and Illinois, would have a different regulation that has the same outcome. So rather than have to meet two standards that have the same outcome, could we not just agree on a common standard?
Interesting to hear that. One would sometimes think that they're opposed, but it's a good point to say that how much has changed over the last 25 years when we didn't have the internet and all the communications and the new technologies that apply today. So worthwhile taking a new look. What about on the, as I understand, the president is looking to put maybe a 25% tariff on steel and 10% on aluminum. How much of the trade aspect would be impacted relative to Canada, and what was Gitane DeSilva's thoughts relative to those tariffs?
So at the moment, because we have the temporary exemption, Canada is happy with that exemption. However, they're putting pressure to make that permanent. A big argument that you hear coming out of the administration is that this tariff is necessary for national security reasons. And so when I spoke with Gitane, she actually pointed out that the U.S. and Canada enjoy a high level of interoperability between our militaries. And so the idea that there would need to be a tariff in order to preserve national security isn't something that they completely agree with. When I went ahead and asked a couple of follow-up questions, I specifically asked towards the idea of Chinese steel dumping in the U.S. through Canada, using Canada as kind of the loophole to be able to do that. And she gave her response here.
Well, I would say that, one, Canada welcomed the exemption. We absolutely want a permanent exemption. The fact that the administration was using Section 232, which is saying for national security reasons, Canada supplies steel that is used in U.S. military tanks. So to argue that Canada is anyway a security threat to the United States is just not logical or factual. If those tariffs were to be extended to Canada for steel and aluminum, then I don't think that Canada would have any choice but to retaliate. The EU has been very clear already about which sectors of the U.S. economy they would target, and I think Illinois would be hit very hard because they would look to target the agriculture sector right off the bat, and that's an important part of the Illinois economy. They'd also go after manufactured goods. So I don't think it's of benefit to either of our countries to go down that road, and we'll just continue to push for a permanent exemption.
You know, too, the president was just recently in St. Louis and talking, and one of the issues that came up, I think, relative to all of this discussion was that Canada actually or the United States, I should say, enjoys a trade surplus with Canada. So when we looked at renegotiate some of these aspects, who knows how the impact is going to be. We might even end up talking ourselves out of having that surplus. But wasn't there some points, just to emphasize some of the things that have been said, where when we are manufacturing, because Canada is such a close neighbor, that there are times where when we're trading with them, the products go back and forth across the border, I think, numerous times in certain circumstances while they're making something. Is that something that you're aware of or had a chance to talk about?
That is absolutely true, yes. So just to make sure I understand you correctly here, Terry, you're talking about products going back and forth across the border while they're being manufactured?
Right, and I mean, a lot of times when we hear trade, we think of maybe dealing with Europe or some other far away like China, where there's no going back and forth. This is kind of a one-time thing. But I think that's something that's really unique. Certainly, maybe Mexico might have that too, but relative to Canada, for our viewers to understand, it's not just a one-way street where we send a product over or they send a product in here. It's often in the course of making a car or something, that part of it is made in Canada, part of it's made in the United States, and these products move back and forth. Before we go ahead, I'm sorry, I was going to say before we close, I wanted to see if you had any response.
Absolutely, and actually when I believe we might have heard a little bit of this soundbite, but when I spoke with Jitane, she actually mentioned cars specifically because one of the proposals that the U.S. has put forth in this round of negotiations was the idea of rules of origin for automotives. And so there's a certain percentage that has to be made in North America and a certain percentage that has to be made in the U.S. in order to be exempt from tariffs. And so she actually spoke specific to this. It was kind of interesting to understand just the nuances, and you can hear that just in her response here.
The reason why Canada is opposing some of the proposals put forward by the U.S. government in this round of negotiations, so there are 5 proposals put forward by the U.S. government to which Canada simply cannot agree because we believe those would be unfair. So one has to do, for example, with rules of origin for automotive. So right now there's a rule within NAFTA about the percentage of inputs into a vehicle that must come from North America and what percentage must come from the United States for that car to be labeled as made within the NAFTA context and therefore not subject to tariffs as it moves back and forth across the border. The U.S. is looking to significantly increase that threshold in a way that would make it very difficult for car manufacturers to comply. Because the supply chain in autos is so very integrated across our 3 countries, and there would be a very direct impact in Canada if we were to accept that, we cannot accept that. So we're coming forward with some other ideas in terms of how to address U.S. concerns, but in a way that would not have a huge negative impact on the automotive sector in Canada. The United States is also looking to do away with some of the dispute resolution mechanisms in NAFTA, going to a solely U.S. arbitration system, and we could not agree to that either. We want it to be fair and allow for representation from all 3 countries if there's a dispute, that all of us have a voice at the table. There's some things around supply management in dairy, for example. So Canada has certain structure in place for how dairy, eggs, and poultry are produced, which is different from how it's done here in the United States. The US has told us we need to get rid of that system entirely, and that's just not possible for Canada. Every country has sectors of its agriculture production that it protects or supports in various ways. It would be no simpler for the U.S. to undo sugar or corn subsidies than for us to get rid of supply management. So that's something that needs to be talked about in this negotiation. The U.S. also wants a sunset provision. They want NAFTA to end in 5 years unless all 3 countries actively agree to continue it. And we don't think that's beneficial. We think it just prolongs the uncertainty, and then that's not good. The reason why you have a trade agreement is to give people certainty, for investors, for businesses, for everybody, and so we don't think that's beneficial. So it's less so that we feel that NAFTA is unfair to us now, and more so wanting to make sure that a renegotiated NAFTA and updated NAFTA remains beneficial to all 3 countries.
Very good, and thank you for doing that. And I know you also, just as part of the background of knowledge for our viewers' sake, that you had also done an interview with the new Consul-General, new as of last summer, Mr. Cruikshank, who is the Consul-General, Canadian Consul-General now in Chicago, and you interviewed him prior to interviewing Gitane DeSilva. So we thank you for all the work that you put into this, and I would say for our viewers too, they could look at the Illinois Channel YouTube site. It's Illinois Channel TV on YouTube. We would have both of those interviews posted in their entirety if you want to see it. Before we close out, any last words, Jini?
Nothing much, Terry, just that the deadline for the NAFTA negotiations has been extended, and I would tell anyone in the U.S., but specifically people in Illinois, to go ahead and look at these interviews, because these are very real numbers. These are very specific. These are things that are absolutely going to hit home agriculturally, in our manufacturing services and everything in Illinois. So this is definitely some important information that everyone should listen to.
It is, and as I say, I think just a lot of people I know from talking to people over the years, they're just unaware of just the vast amount of trade that goes back and forth, and how many people who work in Illinois, their jobs are directly tied with trade with Canada. So we thank you again for doing this reporting, and we'll say goodbye to you now. Thank you again. Take care.
Have a good one, Terry. Thank you.